Welcome to the France 24 debate. Killed in the line of duty is a phrase most associated with police officers or soldiers tragically losing their lives while confronting crime and injustice. Our debate is asking why there are now so many journalists facing the same threat. The EU tribunal is open to investigate deaths of reporters. Its initial targets are the governments of Mexico, Sri Lanka and Syria, and some might say that is just the tip of the iceberg. This Tuesday is designated as the International Day to End Impunity for crimes against journalists. Our guests will have their own take and their own insight. Let's introduce them. Laurent Richard is founder of Forbidden Stories. Laurent, thanks for being with us.
Hi, thank you.
Joining us by Skype from Malta is Corinne Vella. Corinne is from the Daphne Caruana Galizia Foundation. Corinne is the sister of the investigative journalist killed in a car bombing in 2017. Thank you for being with us, very much indeed. Joining us by Skype from Paris, Pauline Adès-Mevel, who's editor-in-chief and spokesperson of Reporters Without Borders, or Reporters Sans Frontières. Pauline, thanks for being with us. And here in the studio, Saka Edris, who is a journalist and Secretary General of the Syrian Journalists Association. Thank you, sir, for joining us. First, before we let our guests loose, let's take a look at a report by our team in Washington, where the last US president, a certain Mr. Trump, called the media, well, the very worst public enemy for reporting the truth that he disliked.
7 years ago, Jim Foley became the first American journalist to be executed by the Islamic State group. His beheading, filmed and uploaded online, shocked the world. For Foley's mother, Jim died for the values he held dear.
Jim died for what he thought was the truth, what was important. He felt it was a job that needed to be done. He was single, he felt he could do it, and he loved it. He loved hearing what was going on and then writing the story, capturing the images to bring back to the world.
3 weeks after Jim's death, Diane Foley created a foundation calling on the U.S. government to do more to free hostages, reporters or not. Today, at least 67 Americans are being held against their will.
It's becoming ever more dangerous to be a journalist, whether in this country or throughout the world. And I think that is mostly because there's so much misinformation, disinformation now, that it's harder for the truth to come out unless we hold people accountable for those who attack, kill, torture journalists. There's no protection for them.
Laila Al-Arian has made it a priority to protect her journalists. After 20 years of reporting, often in hostile environments, she is now the one sending teams in harm's way, but tries to follow some safety protocols.
We try to find out as much as possible about the place where we're going rather than just parachuting in and being oblivious. So we do very thorough research. We always work with local people on the ground who can help us, who can really give us a lay of the land. I try my hardest not to send people who have zero experience in hostile environments, especially if the whole crew is inexperienced. You try to balance that out.
Attacked, jailed, or killed, violence against journalists has been on the rise around the world. In the past 30 years, more than 1,400 have been killed, with perpetrators rarely being brought to justice.
Kerem Gorgistani and the team in Washington with that report. I mentioned linking into that Donald Trump picked out the media and talked about fake news and created this hostile environment, if you like, for many reporters covering him when he was in the White House. It's left a certain legacy. Pauline from Reporters Without Borders, can I bring you into comment first? Your statistics, 35 reporters killed this year alone, 348 in prison. The kind of attitude of certain people in government, in power, makes life for many reporters very difficult, does it not?
Thank you very much for having me at this debate. Yes, of course, the attitude of a government and the fact that we demand protection for the journalists, we demand that those who are at risk are more protected is certainly the main element. Given the numbers that we see each year, even though they drop a bit year after year, it's absolutely essential that all the government who should be responsible for justice in their countries are dealing with the cases that they face, and that they give a response, a judicial response for these murders, and they try to arrest and punish the perpetrators, but also the masterminds of those who killed journalists.
The new tribunal, Pauline, that's open in The Hague, do you feel that this is a way to move towards that kind of tagging responsibility on those who are really pressuring journalists and making their lives and their jobs sometimes impossible?
Yes, the tribunal is a response to this issue, which is a growing issue, because we see various numbers of journalists from different fields. Currently, environmental journalists are very much targeted. So this tribunal aims to raise awareness of the population, but also make the states responsible and give them an opportunity to respond. Corinne Vella is here, and it's very important to recall, of course, first of all, the case of Daphne Caruana Galizia. Our fight with other organizations has led to where we are today. And without this fight, without this daily battle that we run, the case wouldn't be that advanced. Corinne will explain, but when some head of states wants the impunity to remain, they have a lot of means to do that. So our organization are there to fight that.
Indeed, Pauline. As you've mentioned, Daphne Caruana Galizia, and we have her sister, of course, in Malta about to speak to us. Let me just remind everybody of the context of Daphne's case. Daphne Caruana Galizia, a Maltese journalist whose investigative reporting cost her life. She confronted corruption and the wrongdoing of rich and powerful people via her blog. Now, when we say blog, some people get an idea of something that's not very widely read, but Daphne's blog had a bigger collective readership than all of the newspapers being published in Malta. At the time of her death, she was very well known indeed. She was killed by a car bomb near her home in 2017. Corinne Vella, can I bring you in now? Welcome to the program. Sure. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you for having me.
Can you give us some sense of where you're up to right now?
Well, so far, 7 people have admitted to being involved in Daphne's murder or are facing criminal proceedings. But only one has been jailed, and that's because he pleaded guilty in exchange for a reduced sentence. Another person has been granted a pardon on condition he testifies against his colleagues in the crime. But nobody's been jailed through a trial yet. No trials have started. There was a public inquiry into the circumstances of Daphne's murder, which took 2 years to start. And that was 2 years of international campaigns involving different organizations, involved in press freedom, campaigners over here, resolutions in parliaments in other countries, including the European Parliament. And after 2 years, the public inquiry concluded that although they could not find evidence that the state commissioned Daphne's murder, the state is responsible for Daphne's murder because they fostered a culture of impunity and conducted an orchestrated campaign against Daphne, which began in the Prime Minister's office and spread out from there.
And this is something, just to remind people, we're talking about Malta, we're talking, Europe. We're not talking about some far-flung corner of the world that people often report about as having no rule of law, rampant corruption, or all kinds of problems where people, basically are subject to a gangsterism within government. This is something happening in Europe.
Yes, it is. It is happening in Europe, and it will continue to happen in Europe unless changes are made.
Corinne,
the public inquiry issued recommendations which we want to see implemented.
What kind of things do they call for, Corinne? What kind of things are they called for?
Better legislation, root and branch reform, basically, for Malta. But it is aimed at creating an enabling environment for journalism, recognizing journalism as a fourth pillar of democracy and entrenching that in our constitution and in our institutions. It's allowing institutions to work freely. It's ending the culture of impunity for the crimes that journalists expose, which leaves journalists themselves exposed to criminal attacks. Since Daphne was killed, 3 other people have been killed in the European Union. All of them were journalists, and all of them were doing investigative work in their own countries, which statistically appears to be the more dangerous beat than actually entering a war zone.
Corinne Vella for now. Thank you very much indeed for joining us. Corinne Vella there, joining us from Valletta in Malta. Lauren Richard, can I bring you in, founder of Forbidden Stories? Corinne there identifying journalism, freedom of the press as the fourth pillar of democracy. It's something that sometimes people think journalists are being pretentious when they talk about the importance of press freedom. But if governments and authority aren't held to account, then it is a very dangerous place we're living in, isn't it?
Yes, it is. It is more and more dangerous to be a journalist now. I think that when you look at for what kind of stories journalists have been killed for, what kind of stories journalists have been silenced, have been jailed, have been threatened, if you have a look to that, whether they are living in Mexico, in Malta, in many countries, it's always some stories about corruption, money laundering, human rights violation, environmental crimes. All of those stories, all of those topics are extremely crucial for the conversation of nowadays, whether you're living in any parts of the world. So that's why it's very important to do something. So what can we do? As Pauline from Reporters Without Borders was mentioning, there is a high level of impunity. Mexico, it's more than 99%. And in most of those countries, that's the main problem. So what can we do if the states are not running themselves some investigation? So another way to do that is to continue the work of assassinated reporters or under threat reporters. If there is an impunity from the judicial system, at least we can try on the journalism side to fight against this impunity and to use journalism to defend journalism. Because the other victim after that is not only the journalist or the family of the journalist, it's the public opinion. We are missing crucial information. So right after the killing of Daphne in Malta, with 45 reporters, we did the Daphne project. We continued the work of Daphne because it was so important to continue the work, so important to show that even if you kill the messenger, you will never kill the message. So that's also why we need to collaborate much more, because collaboration is clearly bringing much more protection. It doesn't make sense to kill a reporter if you have 45 other reporters ready to take over. So that's also, if we want to talk about some kind of solution, we can at least try that, but we can also make sure that states are recognizing the importance of finding the killers and making sure, because if you have impunity, the other killers will think, okay, I can get away with that easily. So that's what we are facing now. Indeed,
Lauren, thank you very much. Just get a quick comment from Corinne about that, just to sort of bring that family element full circle in some ways. Lauren, Corinne was talking about the importance of the Daphne project. How important was it for you as a family that this continued?
Where do you begin? It was hugely, hugely important. Because, you know, the idea that somebody is killed because of their work, that's just the beginning. The next thing to do is to kill their reputation and then to bury their stories and memory altogether. So we knew Daphne's murder was connected to her work, and it was terribly important to us that her stories continue. So it was a lifeline to see Forbidden Stories take up her work, and 6 months later launched the Daphne project. It pushed back against the attempt to kill her memory, and to kill her work. So on 3 points, it was a very, very important project.
It must be very painful for you, and I can't imagine how painful it is that you still feel that people haven't been held to account, though.
It is very painful. It's incredibly frustrating. Nothing happens without a lot of effort from huge numbers of people. But that is typical in a situation like this. If you're killed because you're covering political corruption that leads you to uncover international crime, then you're working in a country where the state institutions don't function properly. And then when you are killed, the first point you have to assume is that at some level there was some sort of institutional complicity, some reluctance to act. Those institutions don't heal themselves automatically because somebody has been killed. They remain an obstacle to justice.
An obstacle to justice. Corinne Vella, thank you very much indeed. Lauren, you mentioned Mexico, Sri Lanka, one of the governments under investigation by the tribunal, which Pauline was talking about. The other is Syria. Joining us from the Syrian Journalists Association here in Paris is their Secretary General, Sakia Edris. Sakia, thanks for being with us. I quoted a figure from Reporters Without Borders, 35 journalists killed so far in 2021, 348 in prison. But you have statistics you were just telling me about before we began the program about the situation in your country. Can you tell us more about that?
Yeah, hi. Thank you for being here. First of all, I want to express my solidarity with the families of journalists who sacrificed their life for the truth. Let me in the beginning give you some statistic. Since 2011 till now, there are 461 journalists were killed in Syria. 34 out of them, they were tortured to death, and 20 journalists, foreigner journalists, were killed in Syria. In Syria, just like to be a journalist is like a crime in Syria, and Syria is one of the worst places who recorded this impunity with no accountability till now for the crimes against journalists. But now in Syrian Journalists Association, we started a program to make the criminals, to put the criminals under accountability and to start make criminal actions against them in the European court and like in Germany, in France, in Sweden as well. Unfortunately, there is such impunity for the criminals against journalists in Syria, and this, I guess, the international community hold the responsibility and accountability to stop this impunity due to the political interest sometimes, because we know, we documented 33 cases at least with full documentations. We know who are the killers, we know where they live. Until now, there is no case against those criminals. Unfortunately, till now, the journalists suffer because the weak point, in the civilian society, they are attacked by all parties, all battalions, all, let us say, because in Syria we have I consider the Third World War in Syria, but in a very limited geographical area. Unfortunately, they left without any support, the journalists in Syria, whether they are Syrian or foreigners. For example, let us see Mary Colvin, the civilian court in the United States, they sentenced $300 million as punishment as against the Syrian regime because she was killed by Syrian regime. And Remy Oshlek, also the French who was with the Mary Colvin. Also, we don't forget here the others, Olivier Foizat and Gilles Jacques, also Gilles Jacquet, all of them. Till now, we know who killed them, but till now there is no accountability for that. They still are under impunity, the criminals. We are working, we have to work together. Now I'm asking the RSF, as long as they are with us, also to start this program. Really, we have to start this program. They already started in for Saver World, but also the most of the worst place is Syria now. So I guess it's at least to deliver a message. There is no impunity for crimes against journalists.
Indeed, there should be no impunity,
Yeah.
but sadly it seems that in many places...
to deliver this message to the international community as well. International community are very responsible and accountable toward the journalists and their families as well. Yeah.
Pauline, can you pick up from there?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you very much for giving me this opportunity. I think from this latest element, there is something which is also extremely important. Not only journalists were killed in Syria, and it's one of the deadliest country in the world for journalists, but some have disappeared. And so the impunity is the same. The problem is that it's impossible to obtain elements and to obtain trials. Where are these journalists who disappeared? So this is the first thing. And regarding what was said before, I think one of the elements that we should note is that either Forbidden Stories or other consortium who try to establish groups of journalists who share the content of investigation. It is very important to recall also that the perpetrators, those who threaten journalists, but also the masterminds, try to send a very strong message to other journalists, not only those who have been killed and were threatened, but also the others. And the chilling effect is extremely strong. So by fighting together, by establishing this safe, like Forbidden Stories, or by fighting like with this tribunal, like we launched this morning with FPU and CPG. We also protect the journalists because there is the chilling effect is less important. Journalists have to see that they are seen, heard, that they are protected by our organization, by this consortium, by all these means that are established now that allow them to share their content and to talk.
Pauline, I feel very, very privileged because I was brought up and developed as a journalist in a country, the UK, where there's law, where there is an element of freedom of the press, which is very well respected, and the laws are set up to respect that. And you've got to basically, play by the rules in an extent, but you can rattle the cage of government. You can ask awkward questions. In fact, it's expected of journalists to do that. But Laurent, there are many countries, which we've been alluding to here, where you can't do that, where they view the media as basically a tool of government newspeak or propaganda. And that's part of the problem, isn't it, I think?
Yeah, that's clearly part of the problem. I think first, globally, whether even you're living in France or in many countries, there is sometimes a confusion about what journalism is and for who journalists are working with. And the more we have some kind of confusion, the more dangerous it is for journalists, because if we are facing a lot of distrust from the public opinion. They don't believe anymore really in journalism. So we are facing the fake news problem, the harassment online. If you are a journalist in India and if you try to investigate the sand mafia in Tamil Nadu like Sandhya Ravishankar did, you will face a lot of harassment online. So I think one of the first things we have to remind is that every year we have that day of ending the impunity. Every week we learn about a new Mexican journalist being killed or a new Syrian journalist being tortured and killed. And what is very dangerous is for us to be used to that kind of metrics, to that kind of statistics, because we should not forget that when a journalist is killed in Mexico, it's not only a Mexican problem. It's not only a Mexican case or stories or investigation. He's being killed because he was investigating drug cartels or corruption within the political system because of the drug cartels operating everywhere. When it's happening in Syria, it's about the weapon trades between Syria and other countries. It's about geopolitical relationship. So if we think as other newsroom from Paris, from the UK, what we can do, we have first to think in a different way, to think, okay, we should do more stories about what is happening between the Syrian regime and other countries who are trading that kind of weapons, who then will kill the journalist, or the same thing with the US and Mexican relationship, and the drug cartels operating everywhere. So if we start seeing that as a global issue, we can have a kind of global answer to that.
Laurent, thank you very much indeed. Corinne Vella in Malta, can I bring you back in? We saw in our report before we started speaking, the mother of James Foley, who was killed by ISIS some 7 years ago, Diane Foley, talking about fake news, making things more complicated for journalists. I don't know whether your sister encountered anything like that, but clearly with someone who had a different point of view, as she did, and expressed it as she did, and gained a big audience. Did you come across those kind of problems, do you think, that people were doubting what she was saying, or the government was trying to sort of like twist, or the authorities or those against her were trying to twist the truth to somehow discredit her?
Yes, all of that. All of that. It's one of the findings in the public inquiry was that it was an orchestrated campaign. So yes, people often disputed what she said she made up stories, but that didn't stop them reading her. But when you are online and you read a story on Daphne's blog and then you go onto Facebook and you see like 1,000 people saying she's making it up, who do you believe? And to know that kind of campaigning was orchestrated deliberately to undermine her, to discredit her and to isolate her, it's frightening to think that came from the Prime Minister's office. So yes, I can see there was direct experience of that. But to hear it confirmed by the public inquiry was really frightening.
It's a disgraceful situation that kind of manipulation of the truth goes on. Corinne, thank you very much indeed. Just bringing Sakio back in to talk about the situation in Syria and beyond, of course, because as Lauren was saying, this is all interlinked in many ways, isn't it? That kind of government control of information, I mean, clearly it's a real tool that Bashar al-Assad has used to his advantage for many years.
Yeah, well, if you want to consider since the last 40, 50 or 50 years, there was no freedom of press in Syria, neither from freedom of expression as well. Actually, in Syria after 2011, we also start like the principle of my colleague knows as well, called citizen journalists. Those citizen journalists, they suffered a lot because there was kind of sanction to go to Syria officially to cover what's happening there. So some journalists, they were illegally, let us say, through other borders, they were smuggling to inside Syria. Unfortunately, till now, there is no freedom of expression, neither freedom of press, but this is what we are calling for later stage to ask that, because the freedom of press, freedom of expression are the main reason about what's happening in Syria. If there is freedom of press or freedom of expression, that wouldn't happen such in savage way. Unfortunately, as well, the journalism in Syria for the last 50 years, it was like what they receive from the intelligence, Syrian intelligence, and they publish. For example, there's a journalist, his name Musab al-Awdallah. He was assassinated in front of his house when he just started to criticize the regime, and he was one of the first journalists who was killed in Syria in 2013. We're going to do our best also to demand such, for example, now the Constitutional Committee in Syria under the umbrella of United Nations, which is, I don't think the Syrians, they believe in such activity because a lot of contradiction between the opposition and the regime as well. So we don't believe that there is going to be constitution like to protect the journalist or freedom of press or freedom of expression
And of course,
in Syria.
the last thing that Bashar al-Assad would want is freedom of the press.
Well, not the last thing. It's not on his agenda at all.
Of course it's not. It's all
exactly.
about manipulation.
It's not, exactly. If the last thing, that means it's on his agenda, but it's not. Neither the Bashar al-Assad nor the entire regime. Even, unfortunately, to say that some of opposition as well, they don't want it. Yes.
Let's bring in Reporters Without Borders, RSF, Pauline Adez-Mevel, to comment more on that. I mean, Pauline, this idea that journalists are used as basically tools of propaganda, tools of manipulation, it must be very distressing for you to witness that, to hear that on a daily basis.
Yes, it is actually. And I would like to mention what Maria Ressa mentioned this morning at the opening of the tribunal. Maria Ressa has been awarded with the Nobel Peace Prize, a very strong signal for press freedom and for all journalists throughout the world. Maria Ressa, who was actually the only one not present at the tribunal because she's stuck in the Philippines. She's not able to leave the country. She's also facing a number of judicial claims, and so she's sued, and she also is the victim of a large, what she called weaponization of the social media, some attacks online. So she is the perfect example of what a state, the Philippine state, can do when they want to silence, when they want to pressure a journalist. So indeed, Syria is, of course, a terrible place for being a journalist, and it's very badly ranked in our index. But we see that throughout the world, the Philippines, for example, is one of the worst places. And even though the main journalist from Rappler, Maria Ressa, has been awarded with this Nobel Peace Prize, she's stuck there, and she has to face on a daily basis all these judicial claims and these trials that prevents her to work and pressure her. So it's yes, it's on a daily basis that we have to face these problems. Laurent mentioned the Mexican journalists killed one after the other, 9 since the beginning of the year, more than last year, 2 in the past 4 days. 2 journalists killed within 4 days. This is absolutely terrible. And the toll is growing week after week, and we are absolutely, it is needed to work all together and to start this kind of initiative like the tribunal.
It's there's a great symbolism, isn't there, Pauline, in two journalists getting the Nobel Peace Prize, as you were just talking about there. It is a remarkable acknowledgement, perhaps, of the importance of reporting, of clear, cogent, concise reporting, telling stories.
Yes, and if we want to talk about impunity, clearly they sent also a very strong message to fight impunity. It was absolutely cynical, but Russia and Novaya Gazeta, from which that is run by Dmitry Muratov, who was the co-winner of the Nobel Peace Prize, was also the newspaper of Anna Politkovskaya, who was killed on October 7th, 15 years ago. And the day after we celebrated this very sad anniversary, the 15th, the possible trial, possible judicial investigation were closed because there was it was too late. So in Russia, it's the level of impunity is extremely high, in the Philippines as well, and I'm sure that the Nobel Committee has also wanted to send a response to this huge issue of impunity, not only the murders, but also the fact that it's very hard to respond on the judicial level.
Pauline, thank you very much indeed. 8 years ago, this very day, two colleagues of ours here at France Média Monde, Claude Vellon and Ghislaine Dupont, lost their lives reporting in Mali, killed by extremists there. They were on a mission for Radio France International. Their loss, their death, touched many of us here. And I'm wondering what can be done to protect journalists going to such a possibly, dangerous area. I mean, they lost their lives doing it, didn't they? They may have felt that they knew the ground. They may have felt they knew where they were going. They may have felt they even knew the people they were going to deal with. But nonetheless, they lost their lives. Laurent, how do you protect journalists going to those kinds of places where they know they're putting their lives at risk?
Yeah, it's a difficult question and a very difficult answer because journalism is a dangerous job from the very beginning. We know that when we became journalists, when we go reporting in Syria, when we go covering some conflicts. But then when you are covering corruption, money laundering, it's another thing. But what can we do to protect journalists? I think it's all of what we are discussing from the beginning. That first, I really think collaboration between journalists make a lot of sense, and I really think collaboration can bring protection. I think as well that when you look at what the profile of journalists being killed, most of them are freelancers, very isolated. Like I remember the case of Cecilio Pineda in Mexico. He was just publishing his own investigation on Facebook, and right after one Facebook live he was doing, he took two bullets in the head in his car. And he was just reporting about the corruption of a local politician. But he was forced to report on his Facebook Live because he was not having any more newsroom behind him because the newsroom was under attack before that. So what we can do to protect journalists, I think, is to recreate the connection. Usually here, when we are sending a reporter from Paris, we have a conversation with the journalist. We have a process. If something happened, then we can do something. We know who the journalist is going to meet. And sometimes it's still dangerous, and sometimes we have journalists being killed. But then we have to investigate and to find the killers. So that's the other thing about fighting against impunity. But those Cecilio Pineda or other journalists who are very alone, we need to recreate the conversation that is part of the process normally. We need to tell them, you're not alone. You're not the only. You need to know that we have a place for you in our newsroom. At least we need to have a conversation about what kind of threats you receive, what kind of reporting you do. And one part of Forbidden Stories, one part of the activity of Forbidden Stories is to offer a way for journalists at risk to send us and to tell us what they are investigating. And if something happens, then we will be able to continue. Then we will be able to recreate some small or large consortium to continue the work. So I really think that if we think about the killers, do they really care about statement? Sometimes I'm not that sure. I think they care. They do care about statement. They care about international pressure and things like that. But I think they really care about the exposure of their own crimes. If you reveal the identity of their offshore company, they will feel embarrassed because they will find another lawyers to reset the system. So if we show them that we will continue the work, that we are not 1 but 50, I think this. We're not going to win, but I think we could change at least a little bit the game.
Laurel, let me pause you there. Let me bring in Corinne to comment on that one. Corinne Vella of the Daphne Caruana Galizia Foundation in Malta. Daphne Caruana Galizia, of course, killed in the process of exposing corruption in Malta. Corinne, thanks for being with us. I'd like you to comment on what Lauren has just been saying, but before I let you loose to do that, can I just give you a statistic which builds on what Pauline was saying regarding the harassment of Maria Essa, the Nobel Peace Prize winner. Female journalists, 73% of them, according to UNESCO, have suffered some kind of online violence. That is, to me, is a stunning statistic. Do you feel your sister, I think you've said she actually was a victim of that kind of harassment, but also do you feel, given what Lauren said about banding together, that might possibly have helped her?
Banding together, yes. I mean, the fact that you are dealing with several people rather than just one, or in Daphne's case, it was the inverse. People felt that they could get away with murder because she was isolated. So yes, banding together is important. But you can band together not directly. You can band together by picking up those stories and developing those stories and taking them further afield. A lot of what journalists cover when they're covering political corruption is of international interest. It's not just local interest. If you're dealing with money flows across borders, that has an international component. So there are strands in those stories that can be taken forward in other countries and make it much, much harder to shut those stories down by killing the journalists herself. We know that. I mean, we know that it really is the best way to protect somebody is to end the impunity for the crimes that journalists expose. But second to that is, as you say, to show people that they're dealing with numbers and not just one individual. And we know in Daphne's case, at the very least, that really was the case. That the people implicated in her murder actually regretted killing her because of the noise that was made about the murder afterwards. They thought they just could get away with it and obviously didn't.
Corinne, thank you for sharing what is still clearly very painful and understandably so for you, for your family and everybody, but also what is a shining light for what journalism can do in terms of exposing the truth, however people want to keep it hidden. Sakia, you had a comment.
Yeah, I want to comment at my colleague. I would like to say, for example, in Syria, we are receiving daily up to 30 calls from journalists under threat, whether inside Syria or other countries, or especially the neighborhood countries. And we have about 5 volunteers in the association. 5 volunteers, they are considering
30 calls a day.
Exactly. Okay. From journalists or citizen journalists or activists under threat or under attack. So we have 5 volunteers from the association just to deal with those calls, to calm them down, to make kind of mind therapy as well, because especially they are under attack, they are under threat, they are just vulnerable and cannot imagine. Sometimes whenever we receive calls, we hear the bombing behind through the phone. So just imagine this situation. So I guess I will call international community along with the institution organization who are in the media sector really to join the hands to make intensive campaign I'm sure that we cannot stop, we cannot end it, but at least to mitigate, to minimize such violation against journalists, globally, not locally.
And with Syria, and I hate to use this expression, slipping off the news agenda as it has, because it's no longer in the headlines every day.
Yeah, unfortunately, yeah, exactly.
It makes it all the more difficult to shed light on this, doesn't it?
Exactly, it's no more, and we noticed that, and we start to mention that. So the Syria is out of, or you can find it on the bottom line of any bulletin. So unfortunately, that I don't know, maybe, sorry to say that, maybe due to a political interest, and we hope so not.
Indeed.
Yeah.
It's our job to report the truth. Laurent, in terms of what Saka was just talking about, in terms of getting protection to people in those positions, it's, I imagine, almost impossible.
Yes, it's almost impossible. At least sometimes in that situation where you have one country that is really blocked in terms of press freedom, of stories, you can see some other countries all around where you have journalists who were forced to exile and who are there, who can at least try to publish some information. But the question is how to not endanger local journalists who are still there, or the sources. And so it's very complicated. So the question about the Syrian news disappearing from the headlines is very crucial, that we should think about that and make sure that we can continue reporting, even if we're not able to access the country, but find creative ways to communicate with local journalists who are willing sometimes to give a lot of information from the field.
Indeed, it is.
While doing that, unfortunately, all of the volunteer work who are receiving calls are single because they are occupied totally.
Saka Edris of the Syrian Journalists Association here in Paris, thank you very much indeed for joining us. Thank you to Alain Richard from Forbidden Stories. Thank you, sir. And thanks to our guests for joining us by Skype. Corinne Vella from the Daphne Caruana Galizia Foundation. Thank you, Corinne, for all your insight. And thanks, of course, to Pauline Adesmevel, Editor-in-Chief and spokesperson for Reporters Sans Frontières, Reporters Without Borders. Journalists everywhere, keep doing your job. It's of vital importance. Stay with us here on France 24.